Guys, hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast. I'm your host for today, JB, and today I'm riding solo. And the topic for today is how hypertrophy actually works. So hypertrophy, getting bigger muscles, getting jacked, whatever you want to label it as, we're going to be breaking down how it actually works. So we're going to try and dispel some bro science myths. We're not talking about like just chasing a pump or feeling the burn in the muscles, nor are we going to be talking about like advice on the surface level. We're going to be trying to have a bit of a deep dive, and we're going to talk about what actually causes your muscles to grow. So we'll talk about what hypertrophy actually is, what the main drivers are behind it, because there's a lot of myths around that. We're going to talk about what it means for your training, especially for you guys who are listening to this, who are more on the hybrid athlete side of things. We're going to talk about when nutrition fits into the whole thing as well, so supporting the process itself as well as fueling the training. And then we're going to talk about some real world examples as well, because that's always helpful, you know. So if you're really serious about being strong, jacked, muscular, fast, fit, you need clarity rather than confusion, and that's what today hopefully is going to bring for you guys. So let's kick things off. So let's talk first about what hypertrophy actually is. So hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the muscle fibers that you've already got. So you're not necessarily creating new fibers. You're not just kind of filling that muscle up with fluid like you would get when you chase a pump in the gym. Instead, you're increasing the amount of contractile proteins that you've got in the muscle. So those kind of long, thin strips, a bit like you see in a steak. Those are the muscle fibers. They're primarily known as actin and myosin. Okay, and we're increasing the amount of those within each fiber. And what that does, it basically makes those muscles bigger. It increases the cross-sectional area, and in turn, that also increases your force production potential. Okay, so especially important if you'd like to get strong too. And the dominant adaptation that we get from resistance training is known as myofibrillar hypertrophy. Okay, so that basically means you get more of that contractile machinery in each of those muscle cells. And that's exactly what we're referring to when we're talking about real muscle growth. We're talking about that kind of structural change rather than just like inflammation, a short-term swelling or a pump. This is kind of real, like laying down slabs of meat, if you like. Okay. Now, the main driver behind all of this, and this is like probably, if you're going to take away one thing from this podcast today, this is the thing. And the primary driver behind this process is mechanical tension. Okay. So there's a research review that came out last year, and to be fair, for quite a few years now, the evidence has been kind of pointing in this direction. But the main takeaway from this research review is that mechanical tension is the primary and essential driver of hypertrophy. Okay, so when we lift the weight, we put the muscle fibers under mechanical tension. Okay, so they're contracting under load. So when you lift something that's challenging enough, the muscle fibers experience tension, and then that tension sends like a signal. Okay, and one of those pathways is known as mTOR. Okay, little m, capital TOR for reference, which increases muscle protein synthesis. Okay, so basically over time, if we can have a net increase in muscle protein synthesis, so basically above baseline, if we can synthesize more protein than we're breaking down, your muscle grows. Okay, so this is very, very important. It's not driven by necessarily like soreness in a muscle. That's not necessarily an indicator of muscle growth. How much a muscle is burning or how much of a pump you've got. You may have also heard things like, oh yeah, if I squat or deadlift, I increase my output of testosterone, growth hormone, stuff like that. These are all very acute bumps up in hormones and are highly, highly, highly unlikely to actually have any sort of meaningful effect on hypertrophy. Okay. Instead, you want to be focusing primarily on increasing that muscle tension over time. Okay. So all of those things can occur as a result of lifting well, but they're not the cause of the hypertrophy. Okay, that's a real key thing to wrap your head around. So you can get a massive pump without enough tension on the muscles. You can be sore without growth. So for example, one of the ways in which muscle soreness in research is often induced is by running downhill on a treadmill. You get absolutely awful soreness, but I doubt most folks would expect for their quads to grow as a result of running downhill on a treadmill, Okay, so very, very important again to understand that concept. So you can't repeatedly expose muscle fibers to progressive tension and not stimulate adaptation. Okay, so what we need to say is that each week we need to try and or each session there should be some sort of intention and effort to increase the tension on the muscle by increasing load, increasing the number of reps you perform, perhaps changing the proximity to failure as well. Okay, that's the kind of anchor that we need to hold on to. And the reason I keep hammering home about that point of like it's all about tension, whenever you are training for a particular thing, so for example you might be training for some sort of endurance event and you want to still keep your hypertrophy adaptations, if not improve them, not necessarily just maintenance, you need to keep drawing back to the whole theory that we need to be increasing that muscular tension to make sure that that adaptation stays. Now, mechanical tension can come in a few ways. We need to make sure that we are lifting heavy enough loads. We could take a moderate load close to failure, or we could have sufficient volume of challenging sets, okay? But the key is recruiting those muscles. So in order to grow enough of that muscle mass, we need to recruit the high threshold motor units. So they're the fibers that have the ones with the highest growth potential, okay? So your sets need to be challenging enough. So are you lifting in that kind of like at least 6-7 RPE? Okay, so getting pretty close to failure. Are you getting enough exposure across the week? So you're doing enough sets. So typically to start, I recommend that most folks go for like 6 to 10 total sets per week across the week, across the muscle fibers. Across the muscle groups rather. So for example, chest, quads, hamstrings, hips, biceps, triceps, etc. 6 to 10 sets across the week. So not to get kind of too confused, we're not saying here that you can only grow your muscles if you lift in like the 1 to 6 rep range. That's not true at all. You can build muscle with lighter weights, but we need to make sure that we're taking those sets close enough to failure to force that full muscle fiber recruitment. Okay, so that's why if you lift kind of very, very far away from failure, we don't tend to grow our muscles, just because the tension isn't high enough. Okay, now we also need to make sure, as I've briefly mentioned, that that tension increases over time. So if you lift the same loads, the same reps at the same effort every single week, the stimulus just plateaus. Okay, I will admit it doesn't happen straight away, so you can repeat the same performance for a few weeks without much ill effect, but eventually we have to push things that little bit harder because your body's adapted, meaning that that stress is no longer sufficient to drive further adaptation. So what we have to remember though is that, like, if we just try and say, right, progressively overload, linearly progress from 1 week to the next over the next 52, 104, however many weeks, we have to remember that eventually we are going to plateau. So we have to be a little bit clever and we have to look at progression taking different forms. Okay, so we could add load, we could add number of reps, we could add number of sets, we could increase the range of motion, we could improve the execution, i.e. place a bit more tension on the intended muscle fibers. Okay, so remember that we need to understand that hypertrophy is a response to increasing demand over time, and how we increase that demand can look a little bit different from session to session, individual to individual. Okay, so for example, I'm training an athlete at the moment who has a heart condition, and basically he can't necessarily just linearly progress in load because for the time being we have to avoid the Valsalva maneuver where you hold your breath and that we get those acute blood pressure spikes. So instead we have to look at other ways to increase his muscular tension. Okay, so there's many ways to skin a cat. Now the next thing to kind of wrap our head around is this, and I think this is something that a lot of trainees really do struggle to understand, and I think especially ones who have come more from an endurance background. So for a lot of people who are perhaps from that endurance background, they feel like training should make you feel tired, fatigued. Now we have to kind of differentiate between fatigue and stimulus. Okay, so they are not the same thing. Okay, you can leave the gym absolutely knackered and exhausted but haven't created an appropriate sort of like training signal. Okay, so remember earlier on we said we need to activate those pathways that are responsible for hypertrophy. We need to give kind of a strong enough trigger pull to actually get that process started. So again, you can leave the gym feeling absolutely knackered, like you've pushed to your absolute limit, but you might not have created a strong hypertrophy signal. Okay, so you can leave the gym feeling challenged but somewhat controlled and have created a far better one than the one where you were absolutely exhausted. So instead, we want to focus on force production and also quality tension to the target muscle. So if endurance fatigue reduces your ability to produce force in the gym, your hypertrophy stimulus drops. So one kind of like key example of this would be, say for example, you're a tall individual and you are looking to back squat to, this isn't a definite thing by the way, but this is just some examples. Let's say you're a particularly tall individual and you back squat to increase your quad hypertrophy. You may be let down by your cardiovascular fatigue before you actually start stimulating your quads fully. Okay, so say you're doing like a set of 10 back squats, your limiting factor might be your cardiovascular endurance rather than your quads, because you've got such a bloody long way to squat to the bottom, stand back up. Whereas for a shorter individual, such as myself, it may be that the squat is still a good choice because I don't have to do quite as much quote unquote work as the taller individual. And I might find more that my muscularity and localized muscle strength is a bit more of a limiting factor than my cardiovascular capacity. So the taller individual may suit something like a leg press or a leg extension more than myself, who may suit the squat pretty well. So just a bit of an example, just something to kind of give you some food for thought, should we say. Okay. So next, the recovery. Okay, so this is where the growth happens. So we get the stimulus during the training itself, but the actual adaptation, i.e. the muscle getting bigger, happens during recovery. Okay, so mechanical tension increases that muscle protein synthesis for a certain period after training. And then if our nutrition and our recovery supports that, new contractile proteins are laid down. Okay, so if that doesn't happen, then the adaptation is blunted. And then that brings us nicely onto the point of talking about nutrition. So at the most basic level, hypertrophy depends on net protein balance. So are you in a state of muscle protein synthesis, or are you in a net state of muscle protein breakdown? If you're in a state of breakdown, those muscles aren't going to grow. If you're in a net positive state of synthesis, you are going to grow. Now, resistance training itself increases that muscle protein synthesis, and you need to supply enough protein from your diet to actually get into that positive balance. So there are these things that are called amino acids, and we've got essential amino acids. There is one called leucine, which is a big kind of like trigger in driving protein synthesis. So actually making sure we get in enough leucine in our diet means that we pull that trigger, okay, for muscle protein synthesis. Now, in kind of like practical terms for most folks, if you're eating like a varied diet, rather than worrying about leucine, you need to worry more about kind of like your total protein intake across the day. Okay, so if you're eating around 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kilo of body mass, that's usually appropriate for most people. Okay, and unless like there are of course caveats, where one of which I can think of is where perhaps there are certain folks who are eating in a very severe calorie deficit. They might need to increase their protein intake a little bit. But for most of us who are in a mild deficit or eating at maintenance or in a small surplus, that 1.2 to 2 grams per kilo of protein per day is probably going to be about right. And spreading your protein in kind of like somewhat even intervals across the day, say 3 to 5 feedings or meals, can really help to stimulate protein synthesis. Okay. And having a meal containing 20 to 40 grams of protein usually means that we meet that threshold for leucine. Okay, again, assuming that your diet is varied and you get a broad array of different amino acids, usually that's going to mean you're going to get enough leucine in your diet to trigger that protein synthesis process. And timing does matter. Like a lot of people talk about like the post-workout window. Instead of being like a window, it's more like a barn door. It's not too difficult to hit, but the total intake across the day is more important than the time in which you get it in. And also understanding that for endurance athletes who burn a lot of energy, chronic underfueling will limit your hypertrophy potential, just because you can't build muscle tissue without raw material. So not only is it like a metabolically expensive process, like your body needs energy to grow muscle, but also think about you need energy to go into the gym and actually be able to perform your sets to a high enough intensity. I'm sure we've all had that feeling before, where you go into the gym a little bit hungry, obviously underfed, and you think, do you know what, I just can't perform. I feel a little bit kind of lightheaded, I'm low on energy. if you go into the gym with your blood sugar kind of like adequately high, your stomach's not rumbling, you're going to feel pretty good. You're going to be able to get lots of high quality, high force muscle contractions out, which you just cannot do if you're in an underfed or underfueled state. So very important to remember. It's with nutrition and hypertrophy, I think another thing to draw back to is the training is the most important thing. That's the real kind of like trigger, but the nutrition helps to support the process, enabling you to pull the trigger. Okay, you can't just grow muscle just by eating loads of protein or eating loads of calories. Instead, you need to make sure that you're actually doing a sufficient stimulus in the gym to actually grow your muscle. Now, let's talk about how we can apply this to you guys who are listening or watching this as hybrid athletes. So this kind of really is the important bit. So can you build muscle whilst training for serious endurance goals? Absolutely. Okay. But only if you preserve those driving factors, i.e. are they present in your training? Okay. If they're not, you're really going to struggle. And to help illustrate this point, we're going to talk about a few actual people who are clients of mine. I'm going to give some examples. So first of all is Francois, who is an Ironman athlete. So he's got a full-time job, a very busy one, in fact, involving a lot of travel. And he was training a lot, like sometimes circa 15 hours per week. Okay, swim, bike, run, plus the gym. But a lot of people would assume off the back of that, the hypertrophy is completely off the table. So it absolutely wasn't. So there are a few things that we put present in his training program to ensure that this process still stayed present. Okay, so number one was recognizing that his training can work in phases. So when he was out of that top volume of endurance training per week, we were leaning more into hypertrophy. Okay, getting in sufficient volume, higher volumes, really pushing the progressions on the strength stuff hard there. But the rest of the time, we would just bring it back down to a maintenance volume to enable him to recover for both his endurance work and his gym work. We would always put in just 2 structured strength training sessions per week. So we don't always need as much as we think. We can still get in within 2 sessions, that's 6 to 10 total sets per muscle group per week. We focused on the compound lifts. So because we were only, quote unquote, training twice a week, we wanted to make sure those movements we gave him the best bang for his buck and targeted plenty of muscle groups. We also gave him some clear progression targets. So even though, he didn't go into the gym thinking that, right, unless I hit these targets, I've failed, but we did still give him some direction. So some stuff to push through, some stuff to try and progress onto. And then we also tried to consolidate our stress in the week however best we could. Sometimes it was a bit of a scheduling nightmare to do this, but we tried to have his heaviest lower body work closest to his highest intensity lower body dominant endurance stuff, whether that was running or bike sprints or whatever. But what that does is it means that your stress doesn't all get kind of spread out across the week. We bunch together certain stresses in the week so that for the rest of the week, the structures and energy systems that are taxed during those sessions get to recover a little bit. And this can seem a little bit paradoxical at first, but it does really, really work. And in the gym, certainly we didn't chase fatigue. We just focused on muscular tension and building that tension over time. And those kind of session to session, perhaps over longer times, load increases were absolutely enough. And we retained that focus on mechanical tension across the entire training block. And he absolutely added lean mass whilst improving endurance performance. And if you're watching the video, hopefully via the magic of tech, we can put a photo of Francois in. He's jacked, for sure. Someone even told him nice biceps during his Ironman while he was running along. If that wasn't enough proof, I don't know what else I can give you. But then we've also got Ben. So Ben was chasing a circa 3-hour marathon. Okay, so pretty good endurance athlete. We placed his strength sessions earlier on in the week when he was freshest, and we focused on kind of like the core movements. Okay, so again, a bit like Francois, focus on squatting, some sort of hip hinge, upper body pushing and pulling, taking the sets close enough to failure. And again, we didn't really crank up that volume to higher levels because that would only serve the purpose of fatiguing him. We'd give him focus on real kind of quality sets to ensure that the stimulus was real enough. We avoided junk volume because again, junk volume, it just serves to fatigue an individual. And we put all of that into practice and he absolutely improved his marathon time. He even got heavier whilst improving his marathon time. Okay, the guy is now jacked and he absolutely added some lean muscle mass across the whole block. Okay, and then we come on to my man Matt. So his focus was on half marathon and muscle gain. and strength gain, and he wanted to have like a fast half marathon and some visible muscle mass gains. So we kept in at least 2 stimuli of upper body training per week, and we focused not on pump stuff or any fluff. Again, we avoided that junk volume. We progressively loaded his pressing, his rowing, his pull-ups, whilst working around a shoulder injury, I might add. And we managed to manage the interference effects very carefully. Okay, so for him, due to the nature of his job, it's incredibly stressful and sometimes quite funny hours. So we needed to manage fatigue very kind of carefully, I guess. And we'd also needed to kind of be realistic with our expectations from session to session. So if you're going in after a particularly grueling shift, you shouldn't kind of admit defeat before the session's even begun, but you may need to kind of be kind to yourself and be chill with the loading and the progressions. But he's absolutely smashed it over the past few years, and we wouldn't throw in sort of like real heavy, hard lower body stuff right after a track or a tempo session. And the lower body loading didn't disappear either, but we did make sure to adjust the volume accordingly when he was in high volume phases for his endurance work. Always kept in the squats, always kept in some sort of hip hinge. The actual stimulus and increasing that mechanical tension never ever disappeared, and then that growth occurred alongside his endurance performance gains. Okay, so let's wrap things up. Let's summarize. So the big takeaways: hypertrophy is driven primarily via muscular tension, progressive overload, making sure we have enough volume of all of the above, and then making sure from the nutrition we have adequate protein. So are you getting in enough protein to make sure that you exceed the rate of muscle protein breakdown? Are you giving yourself proper recovery time? And that means, not necessarily just days off, but also making sure that is your training balance across the week addressed? Are you just pushing hard all the time? Do you have a case of, especially if you're training as a hybrid athlete, do you have a case of where appropriate, you're pushing your really hard sessions hard? Are you backing off in endurance sessions at times when you don't need to push hard, and therefore you're banking up enough recovery resources for your hypertrophy work, your gym work? And also, are you giving things enough time? So we have to remember this is an incredibly sort of complex process. The actual rate of muscle gain is slow. You need to give it time. You need to give it patience. Okay, you need to kind of look at it as a long-term project of doing most of the stuff mostly right most of the time, rather than chasing absolute perfection, because if you push more towards the former, you're much more likely and realistically actually going to get all that done over time. Okay, if you hit it hard and strive for perfection, I can almost guarantee that your days of being like that are numbered. Now, we also have to understand that endurance training does not automatically kill your gains. It is not like a switch. Instead, it's like a dimmer switch. Okay, not on and off switch. It's like a dimmer switch. So if you introduce endurance training, yes, it might hamper your hypertrophy gains a little, but it is just a bit. It's not like it switches them off entirely. We need to make sure that we don't fall foul of poor programming, underfueling, making sure that we address some sort of progression in our training as well. And if you preserve those drivers, muscle growth remains absolutely possible, okay? Even whilst you're training for big endurance goals. So, if you're trying to chase your endurance performance and your physique goals at the same time, stop asking, can I do both? Instead, start asking, am I preserving those hypertrophy drivers inside my training each week? Is mechanical tension present? Is progression present? Am I recovering and fueling properly? If all of those boxes are ticked, you maximize your chances of actually getting done what you want to get done. And if you want help structuring that properly, not guessing or winging it and not piecing together random sessions, we've put everything together into our Omnia training guide. So it talks about how to structure a hybrid training week. It talks about how to periodize strength and endurance together, how to avoid the interference effect, how to balance out your nutrition as a hybrid athlete, and also how to make progress in both disciplines without completely running yourself into the ground. It's absolutely free. There's no need to buy anything or anything like that. Let me just make that clear, it's absolutely free. So head into the link in the show notes and download your Omnia training guide. So that is all from me. Thank you very much for watching or listening, whatever your chosen medium is. And I'll see you next time.